While we're waiting for everyone to get online here, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Rob Schultz. I'm the Executive Director of the International Wolf Center, and we're very excited to be able to present this panel of experts today. We've asked Nancy Gibson, who is a co-founder of the International Wolf Center and also a prominent naturalist, to take our discussion today as a moderator. Nancy, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and welcome.
All right, thank you, everyone, and I appreciate everybody coming from around the nation as reporters and as experts to help us try to sort out some of the delisting issues. So what we're going to do is I have 4 questions to start with, and then we'll follow it up with a question and answer period. So I want to introduce our panel members. We have Dr. Dave Meach. He is a senior biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey and has studied wolves for 26 years. Also, we have Mike Phillips. He is currently with the Turner Endangered Species Fund and was the lead person for the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone National Park. Along with him, we have Dick Teal, who is the former Department of Natural Resources wolf biologist for Wisconsin. And then we also have Rick Duncan, who is a lawyer of Faegre and Benson, and he's worked on wolf issues for many, many years. I want to remind the participants that these are the opinions of our panel of experts. It does not represent the position of the International Wolf Center. Our mission is to teach the world about wolves, and one of our missions is to provide a forum like this. We're going to leave it to our supporters and the public to form their own opinion. So with that, I'm going to start in with the experts here. I'm hoping that each of them will answer my question and answer it briefly so that we have time for the reporters to also ask questions. So I'm going to start off with Dick Teal. I'm going to ask you, are wolves endangered in Wisconsin?
In my opinion, they are not.
Because?
We have a large enough population. It's part of a regional population. We've been doing studies and monitoring wolves for the last 35 or 40 years as they started their colonization of this state. And the size of the population and its performance in terms of reproduction and such things as mortality suggests to me that they are doing just fine at the present time.
All right. Dr. Meach, would you comment on Minnesota? Are wolves endangered in Minnesota?
Well, you wanted us to be succinct, so I'll just say no.
Okay, but you tell us a little more.
Okay. As you know, there's somewhere around 2,500 wolves or so in Minnesota, and there has been as many as 1,250 starting in 1978, and they have just continued to increase since then. There's no sign that they're showing any sign of endangerment.
Okay. And Mike Phillips, would you be comfortable commenting on Michigan?
Sure, I can talk about the whole Great Lakes states if you'd like, but the fact of the matter is, biologically, no, they're not endangered, they're not threatened, they're quite secure. Dave didn't mention the Minnesota bunch, for example, is also connected genetically and physically to thousands of animals in Canada, but are they endangered per the law? Yes, they are. Are they endangered biologically? No, they're not. And I'm glad we've got an attorney on the phone because the Endangered Species Act speaks to not only biology, but rules and policies and laws. And so biologically secure, legally endangered.
And who would like to speak about Michigan?
This is Dick Teal. I can speak to Michigan. Their status is very similar to Wisconsin. The populations are physically one. They exist throughout the Upper Peninsula, with some rare exceptions. They're doing very well. Wisconsin had about 650 wolves, and I believe Michigan had just slightly less. And in terms of densities and the landscape that is available to wolves, they have essentially colonized and saturated everything available to them in both the Upper Peninsula, Michigan, and in the northern reaches of Wisconsin and in parts of central Wisconsin as well. So they're in those two states, and specifically Michigan, they are not biologically endangered.
Nancy, can I ask how far afield do the journalists represent? Are they just all reporting from Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, or you said there's a bunch on the? How far across the country do we have people sitting and listening?
Right now, it's those three states, unless somebody else can identify themselves. Oh, we also have the Associated Press.
Okay. So, but everybody recognizes that the judge's ruling touched on an issue much bigger than the Great Lakes states, and hopefully, Nancy, our questions will get us there.
Yes, we will, and if not, Mike will you talk about it. All right. So I want to ask all of you: would state management endanger the wolves? Why would it, or why not? And Dick, we'll start with you again, Wisconsin.
Once the wolf was delisted in 2012, the state of Wisconsin legislatively, through the political process, passed a law initiating almost essentially immediately a harvest or a hunt on wolves. That particular season has been very contentious. The gist of it is that they wanted to drive the population from, at that point in time, was 850 animals down to 350 wolves, which is what the Wisconsin DNR management plan, written in 1999, suggested might be a population that could be reached. And keep in mind, in 1999, there were less than 250 wolves in the state of Wisconsin. And so there is some suggestion that state management definitely, in this case, was driving them downward. But the suggestion is that because the state political processes really did not follow administrative challenges and management suggestions, I think the answer really is the jury's out on whether state management in Wisconsin, at least, could endanger them biologically. Essentially, we have to see what they would do, and of course, this ruling will put a halt on that, at least temporarily.
Okay. What about you, Dr. Meach? Do you think the state management will endanger wolves? Why or why not?
Well, legally it can't, because there are provisions in place. There's a post-delisting monitoring plan that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has that watches the status of wolves in each of the states after they're delisted for 5 years after they're delisted. And should any of the triggers for relisting be met, the federal government would immediately relist the wolves. And the states know this. The states have all agreed to these this post-delisting monitoring and the post-delisting plan, and they know that they cannot provide for regulations that will reduce the wolf population so much that it's endangered. And furthermore, they've not been doing that. All of the regulations in the 3 states, the hunting or taking regulations in the 3 states are conservative enough so that there's no way they're going to endanger the populations.
And Dave, do you feel that's the same way in Michigan?
Sorry?
Do you feel that is the same case in Michigan?
Yes, in Michigan as well. Yeah, in fact, in Michigan, you know, they did not even have a hunting season this year. They wanted to, but public prevented that. But even like last year, when they did have a season, they took so few wolves, it hardly touched the population.
So could you speak about the biological effect of relisting the wolf back to the endangered and threatened species list? I'll start with you, Dick.
Well, I'm not sure if, for instance, I'll let Dave talk about Minnesota, because I'm not sure if it's going back to threatened there, but in Michigan and Wisconsin, we'll go back to endangered. And the biological effect of that will be, I believe, that the populations in these two states will probably rise again. Michigan possibly less so because there's less room for them to expand into, but in Wisconsin there certainly is room. The problem with that is that the areas in which they can expand are what we would consider to be marginal habitat, where they would run into conflict and have done so in the past with especially livestock. So I think the biological effect will be that we'll see a shift upwards in the numbers of wolves.
As well in Minnesota, Dave?
Not necessarily in Minnesota. The annual harvest has been so light relative to the total population that whether they're taken or they're not taken probably won't have much of an effect. It would depend a lot on what the state would plan for future harvest. You know, each year their quotas have been different, and it's conceivable that as they see that they can take more and more wolves without really hurting the basic population, conceivably they would have increased the quota, and at some point it could, a higher quota at some point could retard the increase in the wolf population, but so far it hasn't. And so I think protecting the wolves with federal protections now would really not do that much good, because there's not that many taken percentage-wise anyway.
Okay. And Mike, do you have any, Mike Phillips, do you have any comment about this, the state management endangering wolves?
Sure. Yeah, I have great faith the states would do fine. They would not manage gray wolves in a manner that would lead to their biological endangerment for all the reasons that have been stated. I think probably there'll be some increase in the Great Lakes states. Dave makes a great point. Maybe there won't be much of a bounce in Minnesota. There is the potential for this to foment range-wide recovery efforts that would not take place otherwise. And so, Nancy, the question so far, I've had a Great Lakes states focus, and that's understandable. But it really is a range-wide ruling, and it touches on the fate of gray wolves elsewhere. And I think that this ruling has potential to increase the prospects for gray wolves occupying currently unoccupied space in places like western Colorado.
Yeah, and I agree with that, Nancy. And conceivably, even some of the Minnesota wolves, if they were to be continually protected, the chances of them dispersing into, say, North and South Dakota would be greater with the total protection than it would be with the state taking a few hundred a year. I mean, that few hundred, as I say, doesn't do that much, have that much effect on the total population, but it could have some effect on the number of dispersers that leave the state. And I don't for a minute think that wolves are going to repopulate Iowa or Indiana or Illinois, because people just won't let them. But it's conceivable that in some years they could repopulate parts of South and North Dakota where they have dispersed to in the past, and the humans have killed them there as well. But if enough of them got into South and North Dakota, there's some places there, I think, where maybe they could take hold.
Excuse me, who was speaking just now?
That's Dr. Dave Meach. Oh, okay.
So Nancy, a challenge to the journalists is to recognize that while this is a story of great local importance, it's equally important on a national level. And that's not an easy nuance to get across to readers. This ruling is long, it's detailed. The judge certainly did her homework, and it's a story of national importance.
Well, then, Mike, I'm going to ask you this question. Can you give us a history of wolves in politics and how this might affect them in the future?
Well, I think it's clear that without the Endangered Species Act, you'd have a handful of wolves kicking around northern Minnesota and on Isle Royale, and that would be about it. Individuals would persistently try to occupy states like Montana, and they might punch down through North Dakota. But they would mostly get picked off, and I doubt there'd be much going on Northwestern Montana might support a handful. Minnesota certainly would. But the Endangered Species Act is, I think, singularly responsible for the distribution of gray wolves in the country today because it afforded important protections, and it gave the United States Fish and Wildlife Service sufficient rationale to move forward with determined recovery programs that resulted in great successes, in large part because we're dealing with a great ecological generalist. If you give a gray wolf even a halfway decent restoration plan, it'll take care of the rest. And so the laws have allowed for the wolf to become more numerous than it ever was in the recent past prior to the ESA being passed. That said, it still only occupies about 50% of the historical range. There are still great big chunks of this country, the continental U.S., that support extensive tracts of suitable habitat that remain wolfless. And some would say that the law requires the United States Fish and Wildlife Service to look at those places too. And heretofore, they have avoided that kind of systematic nationwide approach in favor of a piecemeal approach that's worked very well, piecemeal being the Great Lakes states, the Northern Rocky Mountains, and the Southwest, and some fitful considerations of the extreme Northeast. But really, this is a national story that has significance because the law has impact from coast to coast, the law being the Endangered Species Act.
Can you brief us a little bit on the history of wolves in politics, Mike?
Well, it's been controversial. It's been divisive. Gray wolves generate a lot of emotion on both sides of the spectrum. It's hard to find people that reside comfortably in the middle. I would believe that myself, Dave, and Dick all reside comfortably in the middle. We differ somewhat on our interpretations of what the law requires, but as everybody, I think, on the phone knows, gray wolves are quite a flashpoint of controversy. And it's not, to some extent, it's a result that the United States Fish and Wildlife Service keeps proposing things that keep getting set aside. And it's interesting to me that other delisting actions that the federal agency has advanced, and there haven't been many, but there's been a few, about 20, it's only the gray wolf that seems to gin up this kind of concern and controversy, grizzly bears notwithstanding. And I think it's a result of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service adopting a relatively modest threshold for recovery for the gray wolf that has not been the threshold for other species. Quite simply, other species are really relatively common at the time of delisting, and that's not been the case for the gray wolf. Moreover, I would remind the journalists that while there's clearly a viability component to recovery as defined by the Endangered Species Act, a species has to be demographically secure, for example, there's also clear reference in the history of the law and the law itself that there's a geographic component. Specifically, the phrase significant portion of range means a lot. And so because the law is a bit ambiguous, Nancy, and because gray wolves are this very romanticized species, the whole thing is caught up in a great deal of controversy and divisiveness that manifests itself in all of these political theaters around the country.
Well done, Senator.
Dave or Dick, do you want to respond?
Well, I think Mike's pretty much right in all that. However, being twice as old as he is, I have some more history. And I was actually around when the Endangered Species Act was passed, and when I wrote the first recovery plan, which was for the red wolf at that time in the early 70s. And I know the service's thinking on all this, and that was that because of just exactly what Mike has mentioned, the controversial nature of the wolf and the kind of problems it can bring to the general public, the service from the beginning has been fairly conservative in the way they've tried to promote recovery of the wolf, knowing full well that if there were too many wolves in too many areas, it could actually endanger the Endangered Species Act itself. And in fact, I think we've seen a bit of that started to happen now in Montana and Idaho. After several court decisions that went against the delisting, what happened? Congress took it upon themselves to delist the wolves in Montana and Idaho. That was a real slam against the Endangered Species Act and a very dangerous precedent in my book. And I'm afraid we might see the same thing as a result of this recent decision. I could just see Congress deciding to just legislatively delist the wolf in the upper Midwest, just like they did in Montana and Idaho, or given the current or the future makeup of, or the makeup of the future Congress, we know that generally the Republicans have not been very sympathetic to the Endangered Species Act, and I could see them gutting the act. And I think that from the beginning, the Fish and Wildlife Service recognized all this and decided that with the wolf, much more controversial than just about any other of the endangered species, including the alligator and even the grizzly bear, much more controversial is the wolf, and therefore they decided to be more conservative, and they, I think, for the reasons I've stated.
And I got to. Dave made a great point. I want the journalists to know. I had to
open it up here to reporters.
Okay. And is this Mike? Is that Mike talking?
Yes.
Yes. And would you identify yourself when you ask the question? All right. Who wants to go first? Hello. What reporter would like to go first?
This is Josephine from the Star Tribune. I'll jump in if that's okay, Nancy. I know, Mike, you made mention of the fact that this is a decision that has national implications. Does a lot of that has to do? I mean, when I read this decision, it seems as if the judge has sort of eviscerated the entire strategy the Fish and Wildlife Service has adopted, in terms of trying to, as you said, delist this animal piecemeal, both in terms of the species, subspecies strategy that they adopted, plus this whole their interpretation of the historic range question of where wolves should and shouldn't be. But that seems to have been their entire strategy of doing this. Was using those two pieces, but that's exactly what she said isn't correct. So is that what you mean? I mean, is this sort of take apart, not just delisting this species, but the wolf in other parts of the country and other species?
Josephine, I interpret it exactly the way you do, and I think it's fair to recognize the judge concluded you can't create a DPS just for the sole purpose of delisting the DPS. It was never the original listed entity. This has a great deal to do with how the law is interpreted both by the implementers and by the judiciary, and a lot less to do with the biology of the gray wolf in Minnesota, Wisconsin, or Michigan. And Dave's right, there could be far-flung consequences. But that's up to Congress to wrestle with, and it's up to the United States Fish and Wildlife Service to respond to how Congress chooses to wrestle with the act. I would have you believe that when the Congress has stepped in and micromanaged the act, as Dave referenced in the Northern Rocky Mountains, the delisting here, there was a great deal to do with electoral politics of the moment. And it had to do with a very difficult re-election bid by a Democratic senator. The Democrats had control in the Senate. They didn't want to lose another seat. And so they were almost certainly able to convince some very progressive U.S. senators to not filibuster on the idea. It's relatively easy, as you guys know, for any one senator to stop any kind of legislation dead in its tracks, given the filibuster rules in the United States Senate. Whether those rules are good or bad, the rules exist nonetheless. But Josephine, I agree with your interpretation correctly. The service adopted a range-wide listing that they've tried to affect through regional recovery programs and this piecemeal approach, and the two just don't fit. Maybe they should. Maybe the service has functionally developed the very best way to implement the act, but as the judges have consistently ruled, unfortunately, it's not legal.
Okay.
All right, another question?
This is Steve Karnowski from the AP. Part of the judge's decision, if I understood it correctly, was her feeling that these wolves in the upper Midwest were still needed to repopulate the rest of the country. You guys kind of touched on this, but I mean, just how realistic is it that the wolves up here in the Great Lakes states can repopulate anything much beyond the Dakotas?
Well,
Do you want to take that, or Dave?
Yeah, I'll take it. Even the Dakotas are questionable. I mean, I feel that there's some places in the Dakotas where wolf population might be able to live without causing too much damage, and therefore being wiped out either, well, surreptitiously, if no other way, because that happens all the time. And but North and South Dakota would be the only neighbors of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan that I think stand any chance of having a reproducing wolf population. There have been wolves dispersing from the upper Midwest into Illinois and Indiana, almost to Ohio, and possibly one into Kentucky and possibly one into New York State. I mean, there's evidence for that. We're not absolutely sure of that, but genetically it looks like the one that showed up in New York State came from the upper Midwest, and the same thing with Kentucky. So the wolves are getting out there, and they've gotten down into Missouri, I think, as well. But you know, they get killed when they get down there, and because it's just too populated, and they either get hit by cars, or they kill somebody's dog, or threaten somebody, or whatever. Hunters mistake them for coyotes. In any case, they get killed. And over all these years, like in the last 20 years, when there have been dispersers from the upper Midwest, so far none of them have taken root in any of the adjacent states. I think that's fair evidence that probably, even with total protection for the next 5 or 10 years, they probably also would not take root in any of the other states, except conceivably in some spots in South and North Dakota.
Yeah, but Nancy, and this allows us, Steve, I want to jump into Mike Phillips here, that this gets to the national component of this decision. The Endangered Species Act allows for more than just natural recolonization, and Dave makes a great point that I completely agree with. I don't think gray wolves in the Great Lakes states are going to naturally recolonize much more of the U.S. However, continued protections under the Endangered Species Act allow the United States Fish and Wildlife Service to move forward with reintroductions, which we know work. And we know that there's large tracts of highly suitable habitat in the Rocky Mountains that remain unoccupied. The best example would be the western half of Colorado, which on every biological metric that matters is a veritable mother lode of opportunity for gray wolves. So whereas, Steve, I don't think Dave is the least bit wrong describing minimal opportunity for natural recolonization due to dispersal from the Great Lakes states, having the Endangered Species Act continue to have relevance to gray wolves across the United States can lead to great recovery actions.
Yeah, and I agree with Mike that there's several places out west that are wolf free right now that certainly could support wolves, and western Colorado is certainly one of them.
All right, another question?
This is Josephine again from the Star Tribune. I wonder if one or all of you could address sort of what you think is going to happen next in terms of the Fish and Wildlife Service either redoing this rule or appealing this decision. I mean, what do you think are the next legal steps or the next legal consequences of this?
And Rick Duncan, who's an attorney, you want to step in on this too.
Sure. Well, the Fish and Wildlife Service will have 30 days to, actually the federal government, so I think they get 60 days to decide if they'll file an appeal. But, you know, at present, you'd have to ask them that, and they probably haven't decided. You know, they have, I guess as a practical matter, the judge's ruling came down after the hunting seasons were wrapped up in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and so there's an interregnum here until next fall if they want to try to do something. I think that's probably a little bit ambitious. So I expect their next steps will be to decide if they want to appeal, in which case, absent some extraordinary event, the judge's order would stay in place while that appeal goes on, and that's about a 2-year process. Or they will, I guess, sort of take to heart what Mike Phillips was saying, that a new approach, a new regulatory approach is needed, that they have not had success legally with their efforts to delist the wolf in the upper Great Lakes states. And then I guess the question is, as I read the judge's order, the wolf reverts to endangered status in Michigan and Wisconsin, and I think it doesn't say this, but probably back to threatened status in Minnesota. And so I suppose the Fish and Wildlife Service would need to study whether they would want to try to put the Wisconsin and Michigan populations under threatened status as well, and which would allow for control, but it would be you know, controlled by government trappers rather than private hunting. So there is that middle ground that they, I guess, could still explore. And so that's kind of the, what to expect, I guess, in the next, coming months up until next fall.
But the judge's ruling, Josephine, also reinstates an endangered status in the Dakotas, Illinois, several other states were caught up in this Great Lakes distinct population segment. And so it'll go back, too. And the service has to do some soul searching. They are about for everything over the last decade and more. And if you're paying attention, you think, holy mackerel, we keep coming up short. What is it about our logic that seems to be fundamentally flawed? Moreover, it's fair to conclude that it may be fundamentally flawed because they've now been in front of several different courts. It's not like the enviros that pick some sympathetic judge and they keep getting the one judge to keep making that same kind of ruling. This is now consistent. And I think it would be time for the service to take stock and say maybe the basics of our approach are coming up short. Moreover, Josephine, it wouldn't surprise me to see legal action now to readdress the delisting in the Northern Rocky Mountains. As Dave alluded to, Congress got involved, the United States Senate got involved, and they affected delisting in the Northern Rocky Mountains by attaching a rider to a defense budget bill. And if that wasn't novel enough, they then said, we're going to shield that decision from judicial review. Well, now, holy mackerel, they're going to take from the American public the right to seek redress in court. That's a pretty big deal. Somebody may be willing to push real hard on the whole logic that framed the delisting in the Northern Rocky Mountains, given the logic that the judge has put forth on the Great Lakes. And then finally, I would have you believe that the service's vision for wolf recovery that was advanced now probably about 2 years ago or 18 months ago, this national strategy, they should be rethinking that too, because I suspect this ruling suggests that national vision is going to come up short as well.
Okay, another question? We're done?
All
right.
I was hoping that maybe Dr. Meach could give us some kind of an explanation on the species subspecies argument in the judge's decision. The sort of the distinction between a Great Lakes wolf and the Rocky Mountain wolves, and that too kind of fell apart under in this process. But I wonder, Dave, I guess the simple question is, are there different species of great wolves, or are there just one?
No. And you can ask all the other biologists as well. Ask Mike and ask Dick. This is all the same animal.
Now, fundamentally, and Dave and I have had this debate a lot, and for the most part, I completely agree with Dave. I've even stated public that the best scientific moniker for the gray wolf may well be Canis lupus irregardless. But there's very good science that says, you know what, sometimes these subspecies are recognizable in a lab. We know, for example, that Canis lupus baileyii, the Mexican wolf, is consistently identifiable in a genetics lab that's slightly different.
Except for the latest publication last week from Matt Cronin, which says it isn't.
And of course, Cronin's work is being sharply. I've been talking. Bob Wayne and I are working on something. Bob's a geneticist from UCLA that will push back on Cronin's findings. And Dave makes a good point. This goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. But here's something that everybody needs to be mindful of that's quite often overlooked or never recognized in the first place. When you read the House report in 1973 that framed the passage of the law in the first place, Congress made sharp reference to the need to conserve genetics. And even if we don't know why the genetics are different or do the differences make any difference in the field, Congress didn't say we want to preserve genetics that make a difference in the field. They simply said we want to preserve genetics. And consequently, when you're looking at how a law gets implemented, congressional intent really matters. When the executive wonders how to implement, when the judiciary wonders how to interpret, they both are fairly advised to look at legislative intent. And it was clear that legislative intent in the early 1970s was preserve genetics. And so at some level, Josephine, genes matter.
But even in the last iteration of the if you do believe in subspecies, even the last iteration, NOACs, it shows that wolves in Minnesota and in the Northern Rockies are the same.
Okay. Yeah, and Josephine, Dave is absolutely right. Moreover, the very careful review of the service's recent vision that was published about 18 months ago, our colleagues that spend a lot of time thinking about genetics summarily set aside the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's wisdom for taxonomy as it relates to gray wolves. They tried to come up with some final answer for what is a gray wolf, and the pros are basically, our colleagues are saying the service came up short. So even if we only recognize Canis lupus, and we only look at the gray wolf as the gray wolf, you could still see where the judge here today that we're discussing was fair in concluding that for Canis lupus, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service has come up short because they haven't done a proper job explaining all of the rationale that has to attend delisting.
Dick, you have anything to add to that?
I agree with both of them.
Okay.
Nancy, you got time for more questions here?
Yes.
John Myers of the News Tribune in Duluth. And maybe, I don't know, Dr. Meeks can start with this, but maybe the others can pine in on with this decision as it is now. I mean, what's the future of wolf management? Do we have to wait for an appeal to go 2 years, or do we have to wait for an federal agency to redecide its total wolf national management plan? And that would seem that both of those cases are going to take long term. What's going to happen on the ground in these states, do you think?
Well, I think there's going to be more illegal taking, and there's some indication of that. I understand from my colleague in Michigan that that's going on right now. I think in Minnesota there's not so much because there was a season when wolves could be taken legally, but I think that, some people Mike mentioned people are very passionate on both sides of the issue. And some of the people that are passionate that want to see wolves off the list, some of those, I think, will be taking more wolves illegally, especially if this decision persists through the next hunting season. It's very, very easy for, 100,000 deer hunters out there sitting in deer stands, and then a wolf runs by. Very easy for someone to shoot one of them and never even walk up to the wolf. And that has happened in the past, and I think there'll be more of that in the future if it stays under federal listing.
I'd like to add that for Wisconsin, this is a big deal. First off, Dave's comment should not be taken, and I think Dave would concur with this, that because we had seasons, that did not mean that there was no illegal take of wolves. We have good documentation in Wisconsin of the continued illegal take of wolves.
Oh, sure.
So it's not a swinging gate either or. So that will still persist, but I think the level of that animosity is probably going to increase in Wisconsin for certain. One of the things that's going to happen in Wisconsin is that with the state of Wisconsin is presently in the midst of redefining or essentially rewriting their state management plan. The question that brings to mind, to me at least, is that the Fish and Wildlife Service, in delisting, one of the hoops they had to jump through was approval of the respective states' management plans. And if the Wisconsin management plan that will be rewritten significantly deviates from the plan that was approved, the question I would have is, the Fish and Wildlife Service, are they then required to reevaluate the new plan? Now, having said that, as just something to throw out there, the state of Wisconsin is now going to be listed as the wolf is going to be listed as endangered. So essentially, on the short term, it's a moot point. Whatever is in the plan, if it has a public harvest, cannot be implemented until such time as the Fish and Wildlife Service either downlists or delists, and in probability it'll be delisting before we could have a harvest. If the ball is back in the Fish and Wildlife Service court, at the present time now, Wisconsin will not be able to take wolves that are depredating on livestock unless there's some real dire need to do so. We have good history of that in Wisconsin over the last 30 years while they were federally endangered, where we really didn't have that authority to take. So the population, we will not be able to respond effectively to livestock depredation. Historically, over the last 30 years, the only time we really took any wolves was over the issue of public safety. So we're going to be going back to that type of management, I believe at least, and I would say that this is going to be the same thing in Michigan, since they will be treated the same. They'll both be listed as federally endangered. The angst and whatnot in Michigan is a little bit less in terms of livestock, because there aren't much livestock in the UP. But in any event, there is certainly an undercurrent in both states of pretty good animosity against wolves that has arisen, quite frankly, in the last decade, while all of these federal lawsuits played out. And so we're back. I think we're going to go back to that at the short term until the Fish and Wildlife Service shows their cards.
But there would be the opportunity if gray wolves can be listed as threatened in Minnesota. There would be the opportunity to allow for a similar designation to attend fairly soon to gray wolves in Wisconsin and Michigan. A threatened status allows for the development of a very accommodating Section 4D rule. You all may know the law defines prohibited acts for an endangered species. It does not define prohibited acts for a threatened species. Prohibited acts get defined on a case-by-case basis per Section 4D of the Endangered Species Act. So there would be a way to respond to the pressing needs of Wisconsin and Michigan. Moreover, I suspect Dave is right about an increase in illegal take. If that's the case, you as journalists could point out to the readers that's exactly what you would want to do if you wanted to perpetuate the status quo, which you apparently find unacceptable. The last thing you want to do now is go out and take matters into your own hands. That's not going to help lead to resolution. And I would challenge the journalists to recognize that if you write about this just in the context of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, the whole thing seems very silly. How in the world can anybody argue that 2,000 plus gray wolves in Minnesota are endangered or threatened or anything other than secure? Well, you can't. Because as Dr. Meach, who knows more about this stuff than anybody, just explained, you can't. It has to do with a whole bunch of other stuff, a part of which Minnesota is a part. But in the context of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, this decision is very hard to understand and justify.
Okay, we tried to get Dr. Rolf Peterson on this call, and he could not make it, but he just sent me an email about Michigan, and he said it might be different from Wisconsin and Minnesota in terms of legal status. He checked with the Michigan DNR yesterday, and the Michigan wolves are not endangered, not threatened as in Minnesota. Lethal control would be possible with a 10A1A permit from the U.S. Wildlife Service. And there are problems getting any more of those from the service.
And let me tell you, we've secured through the Turner Endangered Species Fund a host of 10A1A research and survival enhancement permits. And if the state can make a case to the federal government that by controlling gray wolves in cases or situations where there's problems, they're effectively helping gray wolves throughout the state more than they would otherwise, that would be the bottom line rationale for a 10A1A permit. But you as journalists can recognize now we're so deep into the weeds of the ESA, I'm not sure readers would be able to keep up.
But Mike, this is Josephine. I think your point is that the Fish and Wildlife Service has to come up with a national solution and a national recovery plan. Is that what you're?
I don't see how they're going to figure this out in a manner that withstands judicial scrutiny otherwise. And I will say, Dave and myself and others have been advocating for a national plan for a long time, going back to the front end of the Yellowstone Wolf Project. And we said, geez, what would it look like if we had a national plan for the gray wolf? Would that give some rhyme and reason that would satisfy reasonable people and would stand up to judicial review? And yet today, Josephine, we still can't point to a document, a body of work that would say, here's the national vision, here's how it all fits, and comports with the spirit and intent of the Endangered Species Act.
This is Dick Thiel. I agree with that viewpoint entirely. I think a national plan would serve as an umbrella that could drive some of the individuality of these regions and yet have the connectedness to show the national, the direction that the nation chooses to go with managing and recovering wolves in the United States of America. I think it's essential.
All right, more questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
My name is Eric Osberg,
Yes.
and I just kind of want to follow up on the national plan, if you will. I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth. So, are you suggesting that if you look at just Minnesota by itself, or Wisconsin by itself, or Michigan by itself, could you expand on that thought just to make? I want to make sure that I don't make an assumption here. It sounds like you're saying that if you look at those states individually, it would be easy to say that the population is healthy. But if you look at it nationally, does the perspective change then? Is the national population not as healthy as that state? Is that what you're getting at, or am I misunderstanding?
Mike, you want to answer that, or Dave?
Sure, I can clarify, Eric. Certainly in states like Minnesota, the populations are healthy, and that's a fair way to describe it. That's the way everybody can understand. Nationwide, the gray wolf still occupies 15% of its historical range, being generous, and which means it's absent. Absent, it's not unhealthy, Eric, it's absent from 85% of the range. And of that 85%, there's big areas where they could easily, where gray wolves could easily occupy in a healthy way. And the service hasn't come up with a good, solid, science-based answer to explain why some pieces of this big puzzle are largely being ignored. And I think if you answer that question, it puts Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho in a proper national context and would allow for a more coordinated approach going forward. But be mindful, Eric, it's not just that the populations are unhealthy. They don't exist.
However,
of the gray wolf.
Go ahead, Mike. Finish.
Oh, sorry. No, I'm done, Dave. Thank you.
Okay. However, I think that, well, I certainly agree that I would state the population of wolves in the 48 states is healthy. And I agree with Mike, there could be other places where they could live. If you took this to an extreme, however, yeah, wolves live in a very small percentage of where they used to live. They used to live in the whole 48 states. They can't live in many of those places. Let's just put this in terms of bison. Where do bison live? Bison used to live all from the east coast all the way across to the mountains. And if we were to restore bison to their original range, they'd be in our wheat fields and all over the farms and stuff. This just is not practical. Now, the law might require that if the bison were on the list, but you have to bring reason and common sense into it. And I think that's what the Fish and Wildlife Service has tried to do. I know Mike doesn't agree that they've done it well enough. I tend to think that they have, that this is where Mike and I disagree. I think that with the thousands of wolves in the upper Midwest and close to 2,000 in the northern Rockies and a budding population of over 80 wolves and increasing in the Southwest, I think that's a healthy population of wolves in the 48 states.
And Eric, let me add, Dave couldn't be more right. I'll also add that it doesn't matter what he thinks or what I think, really. What matters is what a judge thinks. And so far, the judges are consistently concluding the service is coming up short. And they're coming up short because of this simple phrase, significant portion of range, that's very, very hard to really understand and act against. And while Dave is right, there's going to be large areas of the gray wolf's historical range where the species simply can't exist any longer. I've had an email exchange with Dave recently, and we both recognize Illinois is forever lost to gray wolves. I agree. So maybe it should say, the law should say, significant portion of range where habitat remains suitable or can practically be made so. But the service still hasn't even answered that question. What makes, for example, western Colorado insignificant? Because if it's not insignificant, but rather significant, then it should be the subject of recovery consideration, which they've never done. So at some level, what this all speaks to is a lack of sufficient due diligence on the part of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. And I think the judges keep coming up with this recognition that the due diligence is insufficient. You can look on page 95 of the ruling. The last sentence of the first section on page 95 of that rule. And she fundamentally says the service hasn't provided an adequate answer. I think that speaks to due diligence. And you know what? We've published this. All the journalists may recognize maybe the Endangered Species Act asks too much of us. If that's the case, Congress needs to amend it. But until it's amended, it is a very demanding law.
Okay. More questions?
Just a quick question, follow-up on well, folks, anything feel about the decline in wolf numbers in Wisconsin as based on their annual harvest for the last year, and whether or not that was more rapid than folks may have believed? I mean, it looks like a more than 25% pre-hunt, possibly 40% post-hunt decline in their overall wolf numbers. Is that all concerning to folks? Were we too good at taking these animals?
Dick?
Well, the objective of the Wisconsin hunt has been to decrease the population from the pre-hunt day. 2011-2012 winter census suggested there were about 850 wolves. Their task, so they see it, is to take that population down to the 1999 state management goal of 350. So however quickly they get there or how slowly they get there, the point is that's what they want to accomplish. And so I'm not sure if I'm answering your question correctly, but the harvest that they've developed, the quotas that they came up with, have the specific intent of dropping that population down as rapidly as possible. And for instance, last year with a harvest of 257 wolves, they are able to take out about 20% of the winter-to-winter population. So that is what the state management drive is all about, and they've set about with quotas to accomplish that task. And indeed, they've seen a positive reflection on that management curve, meaning that the population is in the direction they want to take it, which is down.
Was the 350 approved as under the federal decision? Was that number part?
Okay. Correct. And that was incidentally based on the 1999 State of Wisconsin Management Plan. At the time of the writing, we had about 250 wolves.
Right, but it was approved in the 2012 final decision. The 350 was essentially approved as part of their management plan.
Correct, and that.
We just think if we had a biological reason for wolves crashing 70%, we would do something about it. But
the caveat there, though, is that the wolf management plan of the state of Wisconsin is silent to having a public harvest. That was legislated. It was not part of an administrative drive at the time it was written in 1999. There is mention of the possibility of having a public harvest in the 1999 state plan. I know that because I helped write it, but it was something that was visionary rather than concrete. And so the plan that was actually approved by Fish and Wildlife Service has no mention of the inclusion of a public harvest.
If I can give a little perspective to that, some context, the wolf recovery plan for the Upper Midwest, that is the plan that set the criteria, the biological criteria for delisting the wolf, called for only 100 wolves in Michigan and Wisconsin combined for 5 consecutive years. So in terms of the way things were seen, this first plan was was approved by the Fish and Wildlife Service in 1978 and then reapproved in 1992. The way the situation was seen in those early days, if Michigan and Wisconsin could have 100 wolves between the two of them for 5 consecutive years, that would be considered recovery, so long as Minnesota had a minimum of 1,250. So those were the standards that were agreed to, even agreed to by the environmentalists at that time.
But not in the 2012 final listing. I mean, or the final decision.
Right. But just it's of value to have some perspective on that, because like Dick said, in 1999, when Wisconsin set its goal for 350, That was thought to be a really, boy, if we could reach 350, that'd be great. Well, they're at 800 now. So these things change, but it's of importance to understand the whole context of the recovery.
Yeah, and if I can mention, too, what Dave is doing as a follow-up is that the Fish and Wildlife Service approved the state of Wisconsin's management plan because it said 350, and as Dave has just pointed out to you, that 350 is actually 250 above what was considered to be a recovery goal for both a joint or shared population between Wisconsin and Michigan. So if the state of Wisconsin wants to drive the population down to 350, which is its current intent, it still is far above the federal recovery plan for this DPS. And so, at this point, it's still above that standard, and until that standard changes, it's acceptable.
Yeah, but I say this to the journalist, Dick and Dave, and I've had this conversation before. What the United States Fish and Wildlife Service says on Monday may not make a whit of difference on Friday. The ultimate arbiter about the sufficiency of all of this is the court. And it may be, in the presence of a court consideration, the recovery plan that Dave and Dick are referencing may be found to be insufficient. For example, if you read the plan put together by top-flight biologists that know the species inside out and clearly have a good sense of its demographic needs, its viability needs, there's no discussion of significant portion of range. There's no discussion of the geographical component of recovery, even though it's clear that the law has a geographical component. A judge could conclude that while we have no doubt gray wolves are viable in the Great Lakes states, they will exist from Monday through Monday. They still do not yet occupy a significant portion of range. Or conversely, they're still extirpated from a significant portion of range, so the ESA continues to apply. And so, you guys be mindful that the courts in this country, because we have the right to seek redress, the courts have tremendous influence and I think are fairly considered the ultimate arbiter.
Okay, thank you. Any more burning questions before we end this press conference?
I'm good. Thanks, Nancy. Thanks for setting it up.
You're very welcome, and I just want to remind everybody that these are not the opinions of the International Wolf Center. We are providing the forum for you. This is recorded. It will be on our website, www.wolf.org, shortly, in case you're confused and want a little clarity there. And with that, I want to thank our panel members, Dr. Dave Rich, Mike Phillips, Dick Teal, and the attorney, Rick Duncan, and all of you. So thank you very much.